Welcome to this week's episode of Washington Policy on the Go. My name is Donald Kimball. I'm the communications manager here at WPC. We have an exciting lineup today of Mark Harmsworth, Pam Lewison, and Paul Guppy. We're going to be talking about a range of issues from rent control to agriculture overtime pay, and of course, a road usage charge. So thank you guys for tuning in. And as a reminder, if you ever want to catch these, you can't stay for the whole thing or you miss a week, we always upload these on our YouTube channel under our Washington Policy on the Go playlist. And we also upload the audio as a podcast. If you look up Washington Policy on the Go on your favorite podcast platform, you can catch it all there. We also keep our backlog. So if you missed a week and you want to go back, you can view it there. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Mark to start us off, and we're going to talk a little bit about a bill that he's written on. So I had the pleasure of talking to you, Mark, not that long ago, I think 2 weeks ago or so, about your affordable housing study, which is going to be very pertinent to what we're talking about today. But there is a newer bill since we talked last that would implement some policy that I don't think we like. And so this is House Bill 1389. Which is a new form of rent control that's a little bit different than the previous rent control we talked about last time. So what is this new bill, and how maybe is it different than what we've seen before?
Well, thanks for having me on, Donald. So the original bill 1124 was basically a 5% cap on the amount that you could increase your rent. Relatively simple in concept, bad in application, obviously. But the idea is that a property owner would have to give 6 months notice to a tenant, and then if they were going to increase their rent more than 5%, and then the tenant had the ability to basically walk away from the lease at that point. So we know that the effect of that was going to be that you're going to see increases in rents because the property owner has to cover the potential that they could have somebody walk away mid-lease, and there's no guaranteed income there. And as we know, the majority of rental properties in Washington State are individuals. They're not corporations who have maybe managed to save enough money to buy a new home and they rented out their first home. So this is, often there's a mortgage sitting on that has to be paid. So this is a really bad piece of legislation from that perspective. The new piece of legislation, 1389, takes this even further. It changes it so that it's a inflation-linked increase, 3 to 7%, whichever is less. And then you have to notify. It still has the 6-month notification and all of those issues as well. So it's a much more aggressive form of the same thing, rent control. And again, will drive up the costs of rent. And particularly with the new bill, 1389, what we're likely to see is some impact to the quality of the apartments as well.
Yeah, so rent control isn't a new idea, and that's why it's being proposed here. What are the results of that? Where can we look to see sort of the long-term effects?
Well, it's been tried before. It's been tried all over the country in different places. And so what I would draw because most people can imagine this, think about the Bronx. And you've seen movies, you've seen, folks driving down the street, you'll see all these abandoned buildings, these rough areas. That is the result of rent control. We've seen it in San Francisco. They enacted rent control not that long ago. And what it effectively does is if you're a property owner and you know that you can only increase the rent by a certain amount. Let's say that you're a new city that's just put rent control, like Seattle, it's put rent control in place. So you're the property owner and you're charging whatever it is you're charging per month. And at the beginning of this process, your property's in fairly good shape, I would hope. And that's just why you're able to rent it. As time goes on, you're less incentivized to invest into that property because you're limited on the amount of money that you can get back because of the cap on rent. So if you're thinking, okay, well, maybe I'll increase rent by 3 or 4% this year. That way I can guarantee my 12-month rent. So I know I've got that income. Now you don't have as much wiggle room on making improvements. So as the carpet gets older, as the paint wears out, as the appliances wear out, you don't have enough money to repair that. And so the rental property falls into less, not disrepair necessarily, but it definitely decreases in its quality over time. You get older equipment and so on. And then it becomes more difficult to sell. And then it starts depreciating. Now your investment isn't doing so well. And suddenly the only fix is to evict and sell the property, because a lot of this legislation requires a new owner to take over, or is still restricted by the amount of the increase. So even if you as a property owner said, hey, I've got 10 rental properties, I'm going to sell them to a new guy or gal, and they're going to take these over, they're under the same restrictions you are. So if they take it over, they can't increase the rents to maybe improve the properties. They're under the same limitations. So you're going to end up with something like you see in the Bronx, where a lot of derelict buildings and a lot of buildings in disrepair and poor areas to live, which is exactly the opposite that a lot of the proponents of rent control push for.
Yeah, it also makes me think at the start of 2020, Berlin enacted a big rent control, and I think it got struck down by the courts because they'd overstepped their power. But even after a year or so of implementation, that was exactly what you saw, that the rents maybe were lower, but the available supplies were way down, and then landlords were charging their tenants to repair things themselves at very high fees, and the quality dropped. And so I know I was going to say, even as I think The Economist had written on that and said it was a big failure, and there was a lot of analysis after that. So everywhere we see, you just continually see these sort of lower quality for the people who are living, and then lower supply, and then lower profits for the people who are going to keep building more. So it seems like you're creating a lack of incentives in almost every group, except for the small number of people who get to stay in their place. And even then, you kind of degrade their quality when they have to pay for high price of repairs. That kind of leads me to my next question, which is, is there a clear, beneficiary of this policy? Because oftentimes when there are, even bad policy has some people who it's meant to benefit, right? We might say that in restricting children from school choice, the winners are the teachers' unions, because they get increased revenues without having to compete. Is there a clear beneficiary for rent control? Who does this help? Not who does it purport to help? Because we know who they want it to help, but it doesn't actually.
Yeah. So, and I've been noodling on this now for a while, trying to figure out why on earth are you doing this? Because when you look at the long-term effects, and we've got multiple studies, we've got real-world experience showing us that this is not going to work. And the only thing I can come down to is it's feel-good policy. And it makes you look like, hey, we're going to do something about affordable housing. And there's a couple of points I want to make here on this too. The short term, I think a renter does better. The renters that are in the properties right now may see 1 or 2 years of, hey, I didn't get such a big increase. Maybe it's $100 a month or whatever it is. But then they're going to get to that 2 to 3 year, and they're going to say, hey, you know what? We could use new carpet. We could use new paint. Maybe the appliances need to be replaced. And the landlord's not going to want to necessarily do that until they're out of the tenancy, because they know they're going to have to replace a lot of this stuff when the tenant switches anyway. And they don't want to put the money in because they can't now raise the rent to cover the cost of that new equipment. So under the duress of the current tenant just walking away from the deal if they don't give them that notice. The second thing, I think, and maybe you're going to touch on this in a minute here, Donald, is some of the developers that are building these condos. We saw this in Minneapolis when they put in rent control in St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Paul area there. So St. Paul was the first area that actually implemented this. Minneapolis is considering it. They put this in place, and they saw an 80% drop in building permits for multi-housing development starts. And because they knew that, these developers knew that they weren't going to be able to sell these condos because people are walking away from, not condos, apartments, walking away from the rental market, or flats if you're in Scotland or England. And so you saw an immediate decline in housing starts for multifamily, restricting the market even further, which exasperated the issue at the other end. So short term, I think the renters that are in places right now will see some relief on rent. But when they hit that 3-4 year mark, which is the pattern that we've seen, and they want to change, suddenly the rent's going to jump up significantly, and the quality of the available, if they can even find something, is going to be restricted. So rent control is not, I don't know why they're pushing it here in Washington. We know it doesn't work. We've seen it not work anywhere else. It seems we're throwing it. It's the definition of stupidity, or whatever the thing is there.
Yeah. Einstein's definition of insanity.
Doing the same thing over and over again, right, and expecting different results.
Yeah, exactly. So in contrast, what would we sort of remedy? Because I think there's a legitimate concern about, affordable housing, as you've written about, and affordable, that includes renting, not just home purchases, but also for renters and people who either do not have the means to buy, or then just are in a period of life where they don't want to buy yet. What kind of policies would we sort of offer as the counter to that, to try to help alleviate some of these concerns for renters without going down the path that ends up hurting people 3 to 4 years
right.
on?
Bottom line is demand supply. If there are more apartments and more condos and more homes available, the price and availability, the price goes down, availability goes up, and we can get into more houses. Now, the reason that we're seeing that, and there are multiple reasons, but I think the two big ones we've seen in this area, and everyone knows this, we've seen a lot of high-paying tech jobs, which is great for our economy, because not only do they have high-paying tech folk, those people are now spending money in the surrounding areas for lower middle income jobs. The second thing is the Growth Management Act. For those of you who don't know, this was passed in 1990 by Washington State, and under the guise of trying to solve urban sprawl like we saw in California. But the long-term results of the GMA is that it has restricted us to a point where we now need another 1 million houses over the next few years for folks that are moving into the state, and we don't have the supply, and it's still restricting it. So we need to go back. We need to look at the Growth Management Act. I think we need to relax some of the restrictions that it has on building. I think we need to revisit the Puget Sound Regional Council's target goals. If you didn't know, that each city, in order to maintain its SEPA certification, has to have a certain population level by a certain date, and those targets are set by the Puget Sound Regional Council. And so sometimes that artificially creates higher density than you necessarily want, because of the way the borders around the cities and what's called the urban growth area, which are basically the borders around cities and counties and so on, that are agreed on between the cities and the counties through the growth management boards. So we need to go back, look at that, and I think that needs to be not thrown out, but we need to revise those borders. We need to start looking at those population numbers, particularly in light of COVID and the commute patterns that have changed, because people are now moving further out because they can work remote. And the market's changed, although Amazon's 3 days a week apparently now. We'll see how that plays out. But we got some work to be done there. That will increase supply. There are some things we can do around permitting for new starts to help in that, and not pass rent control. So if you run through a streamlined permitting, you do a little work on the GMA, which this legislature could do, and I know there are a couple of bills that are going through right now that address some of these things, but not the GMA, then we would see a fairly quick response to that. As far as housing starts, you're going to see more jobs in the construction industry, obviously, and then more homes, which will definitely help.
All right. Well, before I let you go, I've got one question from a viewer. We've got a question that says, in Clark County, there is a recommendation to change the impact fees on new home construction that go to the school district. They are significantly dropping the impact fee on multifamily homes and significantly increasing the fee on single-family homes. This is in Clark County. Is that the norm in the state? I don't know if you are aware of anything like that.
I'm not. I wasn't aware that was going in Clark County, but I have not seen that at the state level yet. I will go check it though to make sure I haven't missed something, but yeah. I haven't seen that. And that's sort of a cost shift. I mean, how about just reducing the impact fees?
Yeah.
Yeah. For everybody, not just one category of homes. That would certainly help.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mark. I really
You bet.
appreciate you being on here. And for anyone who is more interested in this topic, Mark's been writing on the blog about this, as well as having published a full study on affordable housing, which you can find on our website. So check that out. Thanks for being here.
You bet. See ya.
So next, we're going to welcome Pam Lewison on. Pam is going to talk to us about ag work overtime pay and that situation, because there was a bill that was going to ameliorate this situation a little bit. There's been a bill that's passed that's kind of introduced this problem. So thanks for being with us, Pam. Do you want to talk a little bit about this kind of whole policy and the whole situation we find ourselves in, give a little background context with what has been passed and what was proposed this legislative season?
Sure. So way back in the before times in 2020, the dairymen, in fact, were sued by a group of workers for not being allowed to have rest breaks and lunch. And that in turn sparked a Supreme Court ruling that considered work on dairies that exceeds 40 hours in a work week particularly dangerous and thus unconstitutional. So it sparked a conversation first around the dairy community and how farm workers in the dairy sector are hired, compensated, those sorts of things. The following legislative session, we as a state had a law imposed upon the ag community phasing in overtime for all ag workers. That phased in approach started last year with a 55-hour work week. This year it's 48 hours and next year it'll be 40. So we are very fast approaching sort of a white collar schedule for all of our farm workers in the ag community. And I think what's interesting about that in particular is that Washington State is both the quickest in this implementation of overtime pay and also the only one where there is not some sort of offsetting mechanism. So there's no tax incentives or any kind of reimbursement, and there is no mechanism to pump the brakes. So like some of the other states that have enacted overtime offer the ability for annual or semi-annual economic impact studies, so we can see what's actually happening and whether or not the phase-in approach of overtime in ag is a good thing.
Yeah, so this phase-in that's taking place, it seems now you were telling me that the bill that would sort of give an exception or exemption, that's now dead. What did that look like, and how does that give better flexibility, just for someone who's maybe not as familiar with the ag work cycle?
So the bill that had been proposed in the Senate Labor Committee would have allowed for ag employers to self-identify a 12-week window for flexibility, where employees would be able to work 55 hours at their regular time wage before the time and a half requirement came into effect. I think the beauty of a bill like that is it's compromise. So during those really peak, crucial times of year when there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of pressure to get a lot of work done, and particularly in a state like ours where we struggle with having enough farm workers, it would have provided an opportunity for the workers that we do have to earn some extra hours, which is never a bad thing if you're trying to figure out how to get a little more money in your pocket. And it would have alleviated the need for our ag employers to figure out a third shift. So it would have been a win-win for everyone, and it's really unfortunate that it died in the Senate.
So when there are these kinds of exceptions being made or protests against this general policy, it seems like opponents of people who want to give flexibility or maybe remove some of the strictness of this overtime policy would claim that farmers are trying to find a loophole in the law, or just generally trying to get farm workers to pay, work longer for less pay. What's the reality on the ground? You obviously are familiar in the scene, not only as the researcher, but having firsthand experience running a farm. What is your perspective, and how do both farm owners and farm workers feel?
So, I think it really comes down to being a math problem, unfortunately. We live in an environment where feelings often trump facts, but this is one instance where it really needs to be about facts first. And the facts are that farm workers in Washington state are among the highest, if not the highest paid workers in the country on a per hour basis at $20 an hour. So when you start looking at overtime at $30 an hour and trying to do the math for $30 an hour at 15 hours a week, it is not something that is economically feasible for the ag community. In fact, if you look at it on that larger sort of annual scale, trying to give back 55 hours to every farm worker who wants it, 52 weeks a year, you're talking about driving our ag community, our economic sector, into a $2.6 billion deficit in 1 year.
Wow.
Yeah.
And this, so that's, majorly for that sort of the whole ag sector and the farm owners. But I mean, based on the testimonies that happened for sort of the flexibility bill, it seems like this also is not super popular with many farm workers either, right?
Yeah, I think you'll find that there's a really small vocal group of activists in the farm labor community who don't want to see what I would consider a farm schedule. They want that 40-hour white-collar work schedule, and that's okay. I mean, that's the right to want that. However, when you look at the vast majority of farm workers who are talking about this legislation, they're talking about how their employers can't afford it and how they in turn are seeing less money come in rather than more. And so it's one of those things where it started out as a well-intentioned idea, but they didn't talk to stakeholders on the whole to figure out if that was something that was actually economically feasible. And now what we're seeing as kind of the blowback of that is you have all these folks who want to maintain their regular jobs and then be able to go home and spend time with their families. And the likelihood that they're going to be able to do that next year, in particular when overtime kicks in at 40 hours, is very minimal. Because when you look at that operating deficit as an ag sector, those folks are going to be restricted effectively to a 40-hour work week and required to find something else to backfill that extra 15 hours that they're used to having every week.
Yeah, I'm just from thinking about it in terms of a flexible, if you're employed, the ability to work at the same place doing the same thing and get that extra pay, even if it's not time and a half. That's a huge opportunity for so many people. I mean, if you could convert that for most jobs, I think a lot of people would take advantage of that voluntarily, without the need for this time and a half.
But I do think the other component of that too is 15 hours at $30 an hour, suddenly you're also in a different tax bracket. So how much of that are you really getting back in your pocket? I would argue it's minimal because most of it's going to be taken in payroll taxes. So
this is all very important and impacts the ag community directly in many of these ways. What do you say to people who, like myself, are either on the west side of the state or in a more suburban or city type area that we might sort of sympathetically hear that and think, oh man, that's bad policy. But why does it impact us too? And why should we care more than maybe just the sympathetic thought?
Well, so I think ultimately what ends up happening is we're talking about an environment where farms will have no choice but to consolidate to make sure that they can keep their employees employed. And when you start to consolidate small farms into larger farms, you end up with those prices being driven upward. And realistically, despite the current inflation in grocery prices, the United States enjoys a very inexpensive and superb product when it comes to the food that's grown here and then in turn shipped to grocery stores. So what ends up happening in that sense is if you can't keep up with that production cost, you sell your farm either to a developer or you sell it to another larger farm corporation. So you have sort of this burning down of family farms and the small farm unit that we all think of in that sort of ideal green acre sense, which is not really a real thing. But if we want to keep our food source local, plentiful, and affordable, we have to look at labor costs, which equal anywhere from 50 to 60% of your overall operating costs already.
Yeah, I can't help but think that, and maybe this is an unfair characterization, but a lot of the people who might support this kind of policy and bill that mandates the overtime pay are also the same types of people who would be very much saying, buy local, support your small farms. And really, they're shooting themselves in the foot when they support policies that are going to undermine those very local farms themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So what are there any positive policy solutions that we would recommend that would help affordability in food production as well as helping sustain farms and farm workers? What's the positive vision we have?
For me, I think the vision should be figuring out that math problem, right? I think we can find ways to make sure that farm workers are properly compensated. And I believe that they are, to be honest. There always going to be bad actors in any environment, of course. But I think by and large, as a community, we try really hard to work hand in hand with our farm workers. Now, that might not always be the pervasive story that you hear because of this small but vocal group of people that we have. But that particular group of people represents less than 1% of our total farm worker population in this state. So it's really important, I think, to make sure that we're taking into account, how small their representation is, but also reaching out to those folks and saying, what solutions work for you? And what we have heard time and again is, I want my choice to work as much as I want to work. So when you have employees asking to work, then it should really come back to an on-farm decision about how that's going to occur. And right now we can't do that because we have this mandate for a certain number of hours before we roll into overtime. And overtime is a really problematic thing here because of how big that number is. $30 an hour is an astronomical number for a farm to try to figure out when you look at particularly other regions of the country where you can pay an employee time and a half and just you won't even hit the $20 mark. So policy-wise, we need to figure out how to bring this back to an on-farm decision, an on-farm discussion between employer and employee.
Awesome. Well, before I let you go, got just some audience questions I want to hit before I let you go there. So the first would be, if this bill drives out yet more agriculture from Washington by making us uncompetitive, what is likely to happen to the land?
To be brutally honest, if you're a farmer and you are being driven out of the market because you can't afford the cost, you're going to sell your land to a developer because you're going to get the most out of your per acreage dollar. And in turn, that means that that person and their children and so on aren't going to have to worry economically or be in a position where they're trying to figure out how to pay bills.
Okay. And then one other question for you is, and this is sort of on the logistics about, if this overtime pay kicks in, can a worker work at 2 farms so that they don't work more than 40 hours per employer, but can still work those extra hours? So
this is a question I get asked all the time, and it is sort of I'll call it a legal gray area.
Okay.
So if you have, for example, an employer who has 2 different LLCs, let's say one side is a cow-calf operation and the other side they grow field corn. Technically, you're still working for the same employer. There's still the same person with a pulse that is paying your bill,
right?
Or paying your wages. So in that sense, no, because that puts your employer in a position where they are in violation of the law, the way I understand it. There is, however, something of a loophole where you could advertise in your break room for your neighbor farm down the road that is looking for part-time work. So as long as it's, my understanding is, as long as it's not an active agreement between two farms that they're going to trade employees, then it's okay. But if you have some sort of contract or handshake, that's when you get into the weeds and have the potential to maybe get fined.
So once again, it seems like a policy which at best has good intentions ultimately drives people to trying to achieve the similar results of what exist, except in a less stable manner.
I think less stable, and ultimately pushing people to maybe seek out work that they either don't have the skills to do, and so they're potentially taking a pay cut in that sense. You know, I think about particularly color pickers. So if you know anything about fruit, there are pickers who get paid a premium because they can decide if it's ripe based purely on its color. It is a very specific skill, and not everybody can do it. And if that color picker reaches their 40-hour limit, then what is their next option? Are they going down the street to work at that cow-calf operation where they don't know anything about livestock? As opposed to leaving them in an environment where they have a genuine expertise that is appreciated and very much elevates them in the status of farm worker hierarchy, where they can make as much money as they want during a 55-hour window. So I think those are some of the nuances that you don't see maybe in other business environments that make this whole thing really challenging.
Well, as I am a fan of eating, in particular Washington-grown potatoes, I hope that we are able to make some more flexible choices for our farm communities so that it can be stronger. Thank you so much for chiming in. And you also have a recently released study talking about this issue on our website. It is a policy note on ag overtime pay. So if you want to check that out, make sure to go to our website at washingtonpolicy.org and read that. Thanks again, Pam.
Thanks, Donald.
All right. And lastly, we're going to have our Senior Vice President for Research, Paul Guppy, come on to talk about the road usage charge. Our Transportation Director, Charles Prestrude, is currently giving a speech to another group. So Paul has courageously stepped up to inform us on this issue that's coming up in the legislature. So thanks for being here, Paul.
Hi. I'm just my lighting here is really bright. I guess we won't worry about that too much, but
I hope that means you're bringing bright, good news. Is that?
No, I think it's here in our that's a little better right there, an adjustment. It's just, I think we're unused to the bright sunshine we're having today in our Seattle office. So
yeah, well, I was going to say it's been raining and sunny alternately here, just making me have to mow my lawn faster. So we've got some bills in the legislature that are revolving around this new road usage charge. What do these bills look like, and maybe define sort of what this road usage charge is for anyone who's not familiar with the term?
Right. So quickly on just the concept is pretty simple. It's a per mile tax, a little bit like a taxi meter. Except in this case, it's the government, you're the taxi, and the government is charging you. So that's the concept. For every mile you drive, you pay, 2 cents or 3 cents or 5 cents. The problem with this idea, obviously, is the mechanics of how to collect the tax. So what the two bills do, there's also the cultural resistance, which we can get to in a little while, that
definitely
it's not too much to say that viscerally people hate this idea. I mean, I've talked to people who just get angry at the very concept. Other people just have worries and concerns, and we can get to that in a minute. The two bills you're referring to are, and the reason I mentioned the cultural resistance part is because the first bill is a proposal that the legislature would pass and the governor would sign this bill that would ask people to voluntarily report their mileage to the state. Okay, like an odometer reading every month or every year, but there would be no tax. So as analysts, the first thing we say is, what is the public purpose of this bill? And the answer is to get people used to reporting their mileage. So this is a little bit like, being in a state like Washington State where there's no income tax, but then suspiciously the legislature says, we just want everybody to report your income anyway. Okay, we're not going to charge you a tax, but we just want you to report the income. So naturally people are saying like, well, why would you do that if you're not going to tax me? So that's the first bill, is to try to get people to do this voluntary reporting. And the second one is a pilot project that has more specifics. Again, it's voluntary. Okay, great. It's a rate is set at 2.5 cents per mile. If you decide to sign up for this program, if this bill passes and one decides to join this pilot program, you would report your mileage. I think they might be going by the honesty system here. Then you would send the government a payment of 2.5 cents per whatever miles you drove. Then you would get a credit back from the government for the gas tax that you supposedly paid, and that's based on an estimate. And there would be a limited number of people in this program. And if you're an electric car owner, you wouldn't have to pay the electric car fee at all. That goes to zero. And then you pay this mileage fee. So there are some kind of accounting and moving parts here. But again, the general idea is similar to what we just discussed. And that is to get people used to the idea. It's to get the government, the transportation department, to set up the infrastructure for collecting the tax and doing the enforcement. And then the real stinger in this bill is, if you read, the great thing about the Washington Policy Center is we read the entire bill. So, pretty soon you work your way down into the provisions and you find out that, on January 1st of 2030, this program would go from being voluntary to being mandatory. So that is already buried in there. And for obvious reasons, we opposed both of these bills. Partly, and I'll just be straightforward, we think they're dishonest. It's trying to, sort of draw people into something that we haven't really debated. And the second reason is just practical, that we think and we can talk about the gas tax and revenue and things like that in a minute.
Definitely.
But the mechanics of this, we think is not good policy.
Yeah. So then, the first question that you would be pressed by a supporter of a road usage charge would probably, try to ask about how you make up for the declining gas revenues, right? As we see in Washington, there's an increased number of hybrid or electric vehicles. There's an increase in remote work. So all of these things have and just better gas mileage in cars, generally speaking. These things have contributed to a decline in the gas tax revenue that is currently being used for road repair, road maintenance, new roads, things like that. So is this a real concern, and how do we answer back, when it comes to this road usage charge making up that difference?
Right. So let me just say this about that. Okay. Step one is language that is used in the public sector is not the same language that all of us use every single day. That's number one. So gas tax revenues are not declining. They're actually going up. They're only declining in kind of a weird relative way based on what the state thinks that they should be receiving. So that's step one. Again, we're trying to promote honest, plain communication with the public. And number one would be to just tell people how much gas tax revenue is coming in dollar terms, not inflation or anything like that. The Department of Transportation tends to hide that. It's very hard to find out that they collected $9 billion in gas tax or whatever it was. And that's, 15% more than it was 2 years ago. Getting those straight comparisons is very hard. That's number one. Number two, declining in a relative term based on the way the state spends their money now. So a public project costs about 30% more than the same private sector project would, whether it's in this state or in other states. We've also done comparisons with states like Texas, Florida, even in some cases, California, where the cost of building a public road is much lower than it is here. So they build in man-made policies, artificial choices that make road projects in our state much more expensive. Then public officials turn to the public and say, we don't have enough tax revenue. So our point is to deal with that. And then the third one is about the hybrid cars and electric vehicle cars. And the legislature has already started to deal with this, which is charge people a flat annual fee. And that is their contribution to supporting the public roads. And that fee, by the way, to make it fair with about what people pay for gas taxes, would be about $300 a year. So if an electric vehicle owner paid a flat $300 a year to use the public roads, that's a fair user charge.
So then, let's talk about maybe one of the other problems that is a little bit more legal in nature about concerns about this road usage charge. So right now, the gas revenues that we get, the direct, gasoline taxes, not necessarily a tax like the carbon tax, which increases the cost of gasoline, but is not a direct gas tax. Right now, our gas taxes are locked into road repair and road construction due to Washington State. I believe it's the 18th Amendment to Washington State's Constitution. Is there any provision in the current road usage charge bill that are being proposed that would lock them under that same kind of restriction, or would they be free to spend those revenues how they see fit?
Yeah, so it depends on who you ask. The defenders of the sponsors of the bill, of course, they're like, oh yes, absolutely, this is a user fee. It's got to be used for road projects. And then you ask them what road projects means, and they have this like super expansive definition. So the 18th Amendment that you referred to was passed by the voters of the state many decades ago, when the public discovered that lawmakers were using the gas tax revenue as a slush fund to just pay for just general stuff. So voters got mad. There was a public ballot measure that enacted this 18th Amendment, and it has specific language that says that auto fees and gas taxes must be used, go into a trust fund, again, trust, quote unquote, because that word doesn't mean the same thing in the public sector as it does in the private sector, but they created an accounting function called a trust fund. And the gas taxes are supposed to go into that fund and and this is the key part, to be used for, quote, highway purposes. That kind of guarantee language is not in the mileage tax bill. And that's what makes people suspicious. In fact, I would go beyond, again, as an analyst, we would say, if that language is not in the new bill, then it doesn't exist. And it's obvious that the sponsors there's a reason that they kept that language out, and that's because they want to use mileage tax money for other projects, maybe related to transportation. So that means like buses, light rail, other kinds of, quote, transportation projects, broadly defined. And we understand that that's a policy choice, but they're not clear about that in the bill. And that's what makes us suspicious.
So the last question I had sort of bleeds in with some questions we're getting from our audience here. So I'm going to sort of combine them, but other aspects that we might talk about, and you kind of alluded to in sort of this initial response of distrust or skepticism towards it, might involve how this information is collected. For instance, one of our questions talks about how my big problem is who collects the data. I don't necessarily trust the Washington State Department of Transportation or any state agency. Maybe if there was a third party entity that did that kind of thing, it would be okay. But still, all of that aggregated data, is that a legitimate concern? And what kind of examples have we had on that sort of front?
Yeah, that is a great question. And in fact, it's a question that comes up whenever this issue comes up. So the answer is, the proponents of this idea, and they've been pushing this for years, like more than 10 years, their timing is horrible because public trust in public institutions nationally, at the state level in general, public trust in media, public trust in universities and academia, public trust in public officials in general is at the lowest levels that it's been in like half a century. So this is the worst time to come up to people and say, report your private travel to us, please. So that person has a great point. The mechanism for collecting the data, they have not specified. So there are different methods. One is, I already mentioned, write your odometer amount into a website and it goes to the state. Number two, put a transponder in your car and that data GPS goes to the Department of Transportation and they collect the data in a database. Number three, hire a contractor to do basically the same thing. So you'd have the Acme Corporation would collect your data, aggregate it so it's private, and then report it to the government. And then number four, the sponsors have already thought of this idea of a third-party collector because there's a provision in the bill, this is the advantage of reading the whole thing, where there would be if this bill passed, Washington state officials would contact auto manufacturers. They're required to do this under the bill, and ask the auto manufacturers, can you report a person's driving to us without contacting that person? In other words,
Oh, wow.
you buy a Ford, the car has a GPS tracker in it, obviously, if it's a more modern car. And then the question to the auto manufacturer would be, can you report that data to the state without contacting the owner of the car? So that's kind of a strange concept, but you can see how convenient it is for collecting the tax. So those are the mechanisms involved. There's also language in the bill, promises about privacy, and they swear up and down that your data will be private, but it's hard to convince people when you just look at the general news every day and a bank or a government agency somewhere in the country is reporting that they've been hacked. An insurance company has to notify all of their customers that they lost data. That's the world we live in. And these assurances about protection are suspicious. I just thought of one more thing that I should mention. There's also a provision in the bill that says that the police would not be able to get your travel data without a quote court order, which to me means nothing, because the police can get a court order on you pretty much anytime they want. You see what I mean? So this is meant to be a civil rights guarantee in the bill that your travel location data will not be reported to the state, or to the police rather, unless they get a judge to sign off on it. And of course, many people today realize, well, you can get a judge to sign off on practically anything. A request from a prosecutor will get the warrant, and then the Department of Transportation will report your travel data for law enforcement purposes to the police. And that also, again, without your knowledge. And that also makes people concerned.
I was going to say, your privacy examples of the data breaches, that assumes, the best, which is they're even trying to keep the data. I distinctly remember James Clapper promising that we weren't being spied on with our phones, and then the NSA kind of got revealed. So I'm also, that's another reason why people would be skeptical, because we've heard promises before and they've been broken. So
and there have been examples of, healthcare providers, a hospital system will notify all of their patients that, well, we're not 100% sure that your medical data wasn't accessed by an unauthorized party. And
absolutely,
the law requires them to send that notice. And when you receive it, you get pretty concerned.
Right. So a last question from the audience here for you, and maybe this is specifically written in the bill or not. So let us know what you know. But this question reads: does the state get around the ownership issue for tracking if it's still under a loan arrangement? The title indicates the owner is the lender, not the person who's driving it. Is there any kind of provision as far as tracking data when that's concerned?
Well, the driver of the car owes the tax.
Okay.
So, I mean, when you say owner, even if you have a loan on a vehicle or a loan on a house, you're still the owner of the house or the vehicle. It's the same thing. And therefore you are responsible for all taxes, utility bills, or any fees that go along with that. I see what the person means. In effect, what it means is that the person whose name is on the title is the one that's going to be responsible, which, by the way, applies if somebody else is driving your car. So, you lend your car to a family member, those miles, if you owe tax, are the responsibility of the person whose name is on the title.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for filling in here on this issue, Paul. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we have some cooler heads talking about this kind of policy in the near future.
Okay. You froze up a little bit. I'll say thanks and great for being on. Thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in to this week's episode. As a reminder, we upload all of these on YouTube after the fact, so you can find the full playlist of the past weeks under the Washington Policy on the Go playlist on our YouTube channel, as well as uploading the last 5 or so episodes on our podcasting platform, Washington Policy on the Go. So make sure to subscribe there if you want to catch up, or you're going to miss a week, and share with friends. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Take care.